Welcome. Tonight's story takes us deep into Louisiana 1856, where plantation records and whispered testimonies tell of a slave boy whose actions allegedly led to the destruction of entire families, leaving fear that still echoes through history. This isn't legend pulled from thin air. It's pieced together from court notes, personal journals, and fragments history tried to bury. Before we go any further, tell me in the comments where you're watching from. And make sure you subscribe because uncovering real historical cases like this takes serious time, effort, and deep research that most stories never get. The boy's origins were shrouded in mystery almost from the moment he was born. Born in Louisiana in 1856 on a sprawling plantation near the Mississippi River, he was the son of enslaved parents whose names were all but forgotten in the official records. From the beginning, he was unlike the other children on the plantation, smaller in stature than most for his age, yet unnaturally perceptive. The elders whispered that he seemed to understand things no child should. He would watch the movements of adults, predict when work would end, and notice conversations that were meant to be private. Some claimed he would stare at the fields or the house and smile in a way that made even grown men uneasy, as if he knew secrets no one else could comprehend. Even in infancy, there were signs that this child did not respond to the world in ordinary ways. He rarely cried like other babies. Yet when he did, his cries were sudden, piercing, and seemed to leave a mark on those who heard them. Some of the older slaves, who had witnessed generations of births, swore that there was something unnatural in his presence, a kind of silent intensity that made their skin crawl. Mothers who had nursed other children on the plantation admitted to feeling a chill whenever he was near it. They could not explain it, but instinct told them to keep a cautious distance. As he grew older, his behavior became increasingly unusual. Unlike the other children who played in the fields, he spent hours observing, sometimes the slaves, sometimes the masters, and would memorize everything he saw. He learned quickly, mastering tasks at a speed that left adults bewildered. He was small but strong, clever beyond his years, and unnervingly quiet. Some of the field hands noted that objects seemed to move around him or go missing inexplicably, and when confronted, he would give no explanation, only a blank stare that seemed to pierce through anyone who dared question him. By the time he reached school age, if one could call it that, as formal education was rare for slaves, it was already clear that he was feared more than loved. Other children avoided him instinctively, sensing something in his presence they could not name. Stories circulated among the adults that he could manipulate animals, that horses would shy without reason, and that livestock occasionally went missing or died under strange circumstances. These were the whispered beginnings of the reputation that would grow into outright terror across the region. The masters themselves began to notice him, and while some were impressed by his intelligence and skill, others felt a creeping unease they could not rationalize. He was obedient when commanded, yet always seemed to have a plan of his own. During work assignments, he would appear to follow orders, yet subtle disruptions would occur, tools misplaced, crops damaged, or tensions sparked between workers, and the adults could not explain how. It was as if the boy was watching, learning, and quietly exerting influence over everyone and everything around him without ever touching it directly. By adolescence, the whispers about the boy had grown into fear. Stories of his uncanny intuition and disturbing behavior spread to neighboring plantations. People began to suggest that he was not just clever, but dangerous. The earliest family tragedies linked to him, mysterious illnesses, sudden accidents, or strange misfortunes, seemed to confirm what many already suspected, that this child was extraordinary, but in a way that defied understanding and perhaps even natural law. The combination of his intelligence, unusual awareness, and the strange events that seemed to follow him made him the perfect storm for fear and superstition in the antebellum South. Adults would warn each other to watch the boy, and some claimed that simply being near him brought an uneasy feeling, a sense that something unseen had shifted in the air. And it was in these early years, in this tense, charged environment, that the foundations of the horrors to come were quietly laid. By the time the first official tragedies occurred, the first families marked by misfortune, the boy's reputation had already preceded him. Plantation workers and townspeople alike spoke in hushed tones about the child who should have been just another boy, but instead seemed to carry with him a shadow, a presence that no one could explain. Every glance he gave, every small movement he made, seemed to hint at an awareness, an intent far beyond his years. This was the start of the story of the wickedest slave boy Louisiana had ever seen, a story that would haunt families, plantations, and the very land itself for years to come. The first family tragedy linked to the boy came quietly, almost imperceptibly, but its impact was immediate and unforgettable. It occurred when the boy was still young, barely reaching his early teens, yet already displaying the unnerving intelligence and awareness that had made him the subject of whispers among both slaves and masters. The family in question was one of the older households on the plantation, respected and long established, with several generations living under the same roof. They had known the boy since birth and had treated him relatively kindly, seeing him as just another child among the many who labored in the fields or tended to chores around the house. It began with small, inexplicable incidents. Animals that had always been healthy suddenly fell sick. Horses would panic for no discernible reason, and livestock occasionally disappeared, leaving no trace. Tools would vanish from the barns, only to be found broken in strange locations, and crops that had been carefully planted would fail despite good weather and diligent care. At first, the family tried to dismiss these occurrences as bad luck, accidents, or perhaps carelessness on the part of the workers. But as the pattern continued, their unease deepened, and they could no longer ignore it. Then came the first death. It was the youngest son of the household, a boy only a few years older than the slave boy himself. One afternoon, he fell ill suddenly with symptoms no doctor could explain. Fever, convulsions, and intense pain overtook him within hours, and despite the best efforts of the plantation's attending physician, the child died before nightfall. There were no wounds, no external causes, only a devastating rapid decline that left everyone shocked and terrified. This was the moment the whispers began in earnest. The boy's cries, his presence, his very being seemed to coincide with the first true tragedy of death in the community. The family was devastated. Grief turned to suspicion and suspicion to fear. They remembered the strange behaviors of the boy in the months prior, the uncanny ability to anticipate events, the way he watched people with a quiet intensity, the small disruptions that always seemed to follow him. It seemed impossible to believe that such a young child could have caused harm. Yet the coincidences were too many, too consistent to dismiss. Members of the household began to retreat from him, and even the adults who had once seen him as harmless found themselves avoiding his gaze, sensing something they could not define. What made the situation even more terrifying was the silence that followed the death. No one could explain the sequence of events. The boy himself did not cry, did not react with guilt or sadness in ways the adults recognized. Instead, he appeared calm, almost detached, his eyes observing rather than participating. Those who tried to speak to him about the tragedy found themselves unnerved by the way. He seemed to understand far more than any child should, as if he could see the consequences of events before they occurred. Word of the family's loss spread quickly, carried by both gossiping neighbors and visiting plantation overseers. It was not long before other families, particularly those who had interacted with the boy, began to notice similar patterns. Small misfortunes escalating into crisis, disputes breaking out inexplicably, and illnesses striking suddenly and fatally. While many dismissed it as coincidence, the consistency of the timing, tragedies coinciding with the boy's proximity or cries created a growing fear. The first family's tragedy became a cautionary tale whispered among other households, a warning to treat him with care, suspicion, or distance. The boy's reputation, now fueled by the undeniable death, transformed overnight. No longer was he merely a clever or unusual child. He had become something that adults approached with caution and others regarded with dread. Visitors to the plantation, unaware of the subtleties that the long-term residents had observed, noticed a strange tension in the air. Whenever the boy was near, conversations would pause. Animals would react with sudden alarm. A pervasive sense of unease seemed to settle over any room he entered, as though the household itself recognized the boy's connection to the inexplicable death. Historians and observers later noted that this first tragedy was critical in setting the stage for what followed. It was the first time a death could be directly linked, however circumstantially, to the boy, and it marked the beginning of a chain reaction for the adults on the plantation. It was a turning point. The recognition that this child was unlike any other, that something about him carried danger, whether through supernatural means, instinctual cunning, or a combination of both. Fear replaced familiarity, and the boy's every movement was scrutinized. From that point forward, the boy's presence became inseparable from tragedy in the minds of those who lived on the plantation. The first family's loss was not just an isolated incident, it was the spark that ignited a pattern of suspicion, fear, and anticipation of misfortune that would haunt families for years. It was here, in the shadow of that first death, that the legend of the wickedest slave boy began to take root, and the notion that his very existence could bring doom became a chilling reality for everyone who crossed his path. The pattern of destruction linking multiple households across the plantations began subtly but quickly became undeniable. After the first family tragedy, others nearby started experiencing misfortunes that were eerily similar, though no one could initially make the connection. At first, these incidents seemed like isolated accidents. Livestock dying overnight, barns catching fire with no clear cause, and sudden illnesses striking children or elderly family members. But as these events multiplied, the whispers grew louder. People began to notice that the boy, quiet, snorts, observant, and seemingly unremarkable to those who didn't know him, was often nearby whenever disaster struck. The second family to suffer was one that had been friendly with the first household, exchanging labor and resources. Their troubles began with strange occurrences. Water in the well turning foul, crops wilting despite care, and small injuries turning into infections that no one could explain. Then, as with the first family, the real calamity arrived. The master of the house fell gravely ill, and within days his wife succumbed to what the doctor called a sudden and inexplicable disease. Their children followed in quick succession, leaving only the servants alive to tell the tale. Those who remained were terrified to speak, for even discussing the events seemed to make the boy's presence grow heavier in their minds. The community around the plantations began to take notice. It was no longer coincidence that a series of deaths and misfortunes followed the same pattern. Neighbors whispered about the boy's uncanny timing, the strange intensity of his gaze, and the way small, seemingly insignificant actions he took always preceded disasters. His intelligence, which once had seemed remarkable and harmless, was now frightening. Some claimed he could manipulate events without even touching anything, a tool left in the wrong place, a word spoken at the right moment, a glance that seemed to unsettle animals or people. Whatever it was, his influence became impossible to ignore. By the time the third household experienced tragedy, fear had become rampant. This family had been relatively cautious around the boy, keeping him on the periphery of their daily life. Yet misfortune still found them. Their livestock was found dead in the fields one morning, and a barn burned down without a trace of who or what had caused it. Then the children of the family fell ill with a sudden fever, and within weeks both parents were dead as well. The survivors, mostly enslaved workers who had been close to the boy, began to avoid him, whispering warnings to each other about the curse that seemed to follow him wherever he went. The link between these events was undeniable to the enslaved people who observed him daily. They had seen his subtle actions, the quiet manipulations of his surroundings, and the unsettling way he seemed to anticipate danger before anyone else did. Masters and overseers, however, were less willing to accept these notions. Some tried to rationalize the deaths as poor health, bad luck, or laziness in caretaking. But no matter how hard they tried, they could not explain why the tragedies followed a single child so consistently. The fear grew not just from what he had done, but from what people believed he could do. The fourth family suffered a tragedy that pushed the entire community into panic. This household had been wealthy and influential, and many locals assumed they would be insulated from misfortune. Yet a series of unexplained events, sudden livestock deaths, mysterious fires, and illnesses striking multiple family members at once mirrored the pattern of the previous households. The boy was known to have been near the property at the time, helping in small ways with chores, and the coincidence was too strong to ignore. By now, his reputation was cemented. He was seen as a harbinger of death, an agent of inexplicable destruction that no human or natural force could explain. Even the surrounding towns began to fear the boy. Parents warned their children to stay away, and travelers passing through the plantations were told stories of a child whose presence was tied to calamity. The boy himself remained largely silent, neither confessing nor reacting with visible emotion to the suffering around him. His calm demeanor only heightened the terror he inspired, for the adults could see that he understood the consequences of events in a way that no child should. What made these linked tragedies particularly terrifying was the unpredictability. There was no rhyme or reason to when or where the disasters would strike. It was not confined to one household or one plantation. Misfortune seemed to radiate outward in waves, always leaving a trail of devastation. People speculated about curses, evil spirits, and unnatural powers, but none of these explanations could satisfy the repeated patterns. The boy became a living symbol of dread, an entity whose intelligence and subtle manipulation could not be restrained. By the time multiple families had been affected, the boy's presence had fundamentally changed life on the plantations. Children were kept away from him. Adults approached him with extreme caution, and even the most rational overseers admitted that something about him defied explanation. No one dared to directly challenge him or confront him for fear of what might happen. The boy had transcended the role of a simple child. He had become a force, an agent whose actions were entwined with the suffering and misfortune of those around him. The link between the households was more than coincidence. It was an unmistakable pattern that terrified everyone who witnessed it. This boy, seemingly ordinary to the untrained eye, was at the center of a chain of destruction that left entire families decimated, their lives altered forever. His presence became a living reminder that some children are more than they appear, and that in his case, intelligence and awareness had fused with something dark, something powerful enough to rewrite the lives of everyone he touched. The fear, silence, and failed attempts to stop what was unfolding around the boy created an atmosphere that was as tense as it was desperate. By the time the fourth family's tragedy struck, the local community had become acutely aware that the disasters were no ordinary accidents. Whispers ran through the plantations and nearby towns that the boy carried with him a dark, inexplicable force, though no one could name it or prove it. Adults, both enslaved and free, approached him cautiously, often speaking to one another in hushed tones about his uncanny ability to anticipate events or influence outcomes in ways that defied reason. The fear was pervasive, yet few dared to act openly, because confronting the boy directly seemed to bring more misfortune, and nobody could predict what might happen if they tried. Attempts to intervene began slowly and cautiously. Some masters called in doctors and midwives, hoping medical explanations could account for the boy's influence. The physicians examined him, noting his health, intelligence, and composure, but found nothing outwardly dangerous. Yet the coincidences were undeniable tragedies, and sudden deaths continued to occur wherever he was present. Frustrated and fearful, the plantation overseers began to impose strict rules, trying to separate him from other children, confining him to chores that kept him under supervision and restricting his interactions with others. Despite these measures, accidents persisted, barns mysteriously burned, animals died, and illnesses spread in patterns that no one could explain. The enslaved community, who had witnessed the boy's intelligence and quiet manipulations firsthand, began to practice avoidance as a protective measure. Parents told their children to stay away. Workers whispered instructions to ignore him, and even those who had grown attached tried to minimize their interactions. They sensed that any direct confrontation could trigger misfortune. But remaining silent came with its own burden. Many carried guilt, feeling powerless to protect the families who were being destroyed and unable to warn the outsiders who might cross paths with him. Superstitions began to grow alongside fear. Some believed the boy was cursed, a vessel for a malevolent spirit, or perhaps even the embodiment of revenge for wrongs no one could trace. Others suspected he possessed an innate, inexplicable ability to influence life and death around him, an ability that science could not touch and tradition could not explain. Meetings were held secretly among the plantation owners discussing whether he should be sold, punished, or sent away. Yet each option was fraught with uncertainty. Sending him to another plantation could spread the calamity, and punishment had no apparent effect. After every attempt to discipline or confine him, misfortunes continued, reinforcing the belief that he was more than a child, more than human. Fear became institutionalized, silently governing the behavior of the plantation. Workers avoided speaking loudly around him, often leaving rooms when he entered. Masters instructed children to give him space, and even casual greetings were performed with caution. The boy's presence created a paradox. No one could act against him without risking disaster. Yet ignoring him did not stop the misfortune either. This created a tense equilibrium of fear and avoidance, a state that the community maintained for years with dread lurking in every glance and every step. Attempts to explain his actions through logic were equally futile. Physicians, clergy, and other educated individuals offered theories, but none were satisfactory. Some blamed environmental factors or disease. Others argued that fear and superstition amplified ordinary accidents, but the sequence and timing of deaths and accidents defied probability. Entire households had been destroyed in ways that suggested deliberate influence. Yet the boy never admitted to causing harm, never spoke in ways that could confirm intent. His silence, in fact, magnified the terror, for it implied awareness, cunning, and deliberate control over events, whether human or supernatural. By this point, the boy's reputation had become legendary. Stories spread across plantations and nearby towns, warning families to keep their distance. Even strangers visiting from far-off areas heard of him before encountering him, and many altered their routes or avoided the plantations altogether. Fear had become a social force, shaping behavior as much as any physical law. Children were taught to recognize his presence and avoid it at all costs, while adults, no matter how skeptical, moved cautiously around him. The boy's influence was not merely physical or immediate. It was psychological. People reported feeling a presence, a tension in the air whenever he was near. Animals behaved strangely. Fires broke out in unexplained ways, and tools went missing or were sabotaged without any human explanation. Families that tried to remain rational eventually began to accept that he was the center of a web of misfortune that could not be undone. The silence surrounding him was deliberate, both out of fear of provoking him and in resignation to the inexplicable pattern of destruction he seemed to carry. What ultimately defined this period was the inability of anyone, slave or master, to stop the unfolding tragedies. All measures failed. Punishment, confinement, separation, and even prayer yielded no results. The boy remained the quiet epicenter of disaster, untouchable yet omnipresent. His intelligence and awareness, combined with the uncanny timing of each misfortune, created an aura of inevitability. Families could do nothing to protect themselves. Attempts to intervene only reinforced the impression that his influence was absolute. Fear and silence became both the shield and the prison of those around him as they lived in constant anticipation of the next tragedy. In the end, the boy's early years set the stage for his dark legacy. His ability to observe, anticipate, and manipulate his environment, combined with the fear and superstition it inspired, allowed him to operate within a network of destruction that no adult could contain. The attempts to stop him failed, not because of negligence, but because the boy's actions and presence were beyond the understanding or control of anyone who tried. The community's fear combined with his mysterious capabilities created a cycle of terror, ensuring that his legend and the chilling tales of his influence would endure long after the plantations themselves had faded from history. The final incident that sealed the boy's place in Louisiana's darkest history was a culmination of years of fear, tragedy, and unexplainable events. By this time, the boy was no longer seen simply as a mischievous child or a peculiar presence on the plantation. He had become a living symbol of dread, a figure whose very existence seemed intertwined with death and misfortune. Families had already been destroyed, livelihoods ruined, and entire communities whispered his name with a mixture of awe and terror. What happened next would ensure that his story would be remembered long after the fields grew silent. The incident began quietly, as many of the earlier events had, with small disturbances that went almost unnoticed at first. A nearby plantation reported that livestock had died overnight, a few cows, some chickens, and that a fire had broken out in a barn, leaving the workers scrambling to save what little remained. Tools went missing, stored grain rotted inexplicably, and the crops, which had appeared healthy, began to fail in patches. Though the community had learned to expect strange events in his presence, there was a growing unease because this time the events seemed to intensify. The boy himself appeared calm, almost detached, as though aware that the consequences of his actions were imminent and unavoidable. The tragedy struck when an influential family long considered untouchable by misfortune suffered a sudden and catastrophic loss. Within days, the father became gravely ill with symptoms that baffled the local doctor, while his wife and children followed one by one in rapid succession. The speed and severity of the deaths were unprecedented, and there were no obvious causes, no disease outbreak, no accident, no environmental factor that could account for what was happening. Those who had previously tried to rationalize the boy's earlier misfortunes as coincidence could no longer deny that something beyond explanation was occurring. What made this final incident so horrific was the way it unfolded in full view of the community. Neighbors came to offer support only to witness the boy nearby observing with an unsettling calmness as the events transpired. Adults who had once attempted to discipline him or separate him from the households now stepped back, fearing that any interference might worsen the situation. Even the enslaved workers, who had grown familiar with his presence over the years, approached him with a mix of reverence and terror, whispering prayers under their breath as they watched the destruction spread. Attempts to intervene were futile. Local authorities and plantation owners tried to quarantine the boy, keeping him confined to a single area of the property. But misfortunes continued to strike regardless of where he was placed. Fires erupted in other fields, livestock continued to die, and illnesses seemed to follow the pattern that had been established years earlier. The boy's silence and unflinching composure only intensified the fear, suggesting that he understood the consequences of his presence in a way that no one else could. His eyes, calm and steady, seemed to pierce through anyone who dared look directly at him, leaving them with the chilling impression that he was in control of events far beyond their comprehension. The final blow came when the last members of the influential family perished under mysterious circumstances, leaving the household entirely decimated. By now, the pattern was unmistakable. Wherever the boy was present, misfortune and death seemed inevitable. The plantation workers who remained were left to tend the abandoned fields and homes in silence, fearful of drawing attention from the boy. Even the neighbors, who had once dared to cross paths with him, began to avoid the area entirely, leaving the plantation isolated and steeped in a sense of dread that would persist for years. This incident solidified the boy's reputation as the wickedest slave child in Louisiana history. His influence, whether supernatural or an uncanny manipulation of his environment, had now been demonstrated beyond question. Stories spread throughout the region, carried on the whispers of workers, overseers, and neighboring families. They spoke of his uncanny intelligence, his silent observation, and the unexplainable sequence of deaths and disasters that followed him. He became a figure of legend, a symbol of fear that transcended his years and marked him as an almost mythic presence in local history. After this final tragedy, plantation owners and local authorities realized that conventional means of control were useless. Attempts to punish, sell, or remove the boy were met with continued disasters, reinforcing the idea that his presence alone carried a destructive power. Fear became the ruling force in the area, dictating behavior, conversations, and even the movement of people and goods across plantations. Families that had once considered themselves safe now lived in constant vigilance, and even generations later, tales of the boy's wickedness were recounted as warnings to children and newcomers. The final incident was not just a personal tragedy for the families involved. It reshaped the collective consciousness of the community. The boy's life and actions had become a lens through which people understood the fragility of their existence and the limits of their control over life and death. He was no longer just a child on a plantation. He was a force that history could not ignore. From that moment forward, the story of the wickedest slave boy became inseparable from the land itself, embedded in the whispered histories, the fearful traditions, and the memories of those who survived to tell the tale. This culmination ensured that his legacy would endure. The boy's uncanny intelligence, combined with the tragic pattern of destruction that followed him, created a legend that transcended his lifetime. Even as the plantations were abandoned or transformed over time, the memory of what he had wrought remained a dark undercurrent in Louisiana folklore. The final incident was the defining moment that etched his name into history, not merely as a mischievous or clever child, but as a singular figure whose existence had irrevocably altered the lives of entire families and left an indelible mark on the region's collective consciousness. Collective consciousness. Collective consciousness. Collective consciousness.